Episode 522. I'll make sure I don't butcher it because I got it screenshotted right here because I always end up butchering titles of Taylor Downing, the author of 1983, Reagan Andropov in a World on the Brink, about primarily about Operation Able Archer. And side note, there's nothing like a brand new camera to really showcase your acne. You know, maybe I like the 720p camera instead of the 4K one. But Mr. Downing, please introduce yourself, sir.
My name is Taylor Downing. I'm a historian based in the UK. For part of my career, I was producing historical documentaries, and I worked on a big CNN Ted Turner documentary in the 1990s called Cold War, big 24-hour series, amongst many other things. But in the last 10, 15 years, I've been doing writing rather than TV work. But this subject of 1983 sort of spans the two, because I made a documentary about the subject. Back in 2008, I produced the documentary. And I've also written a book, as you've just said, with the latest information that's available on this remarkable story.
1983, for everybody listening, as I was telling you before, the variety of guests I have. So for all of my my Cold War buffs listening, this is one of those episodes. I highly, and as I was just telling you beforehand, hey, I'm my own boss. Nobody tells me to have guests on. I only have on authors that I want to have on. I love the book. The narrator, I'm an audiobook connoisseur. The narrator's perfect. The book is terrifying. The book is, to me, I didn't know until 2021, is the lesser known almost Cuban Missile Crisis, if you will. It's 20 years 19 years removed, but it's a newer, it's a Reagan-esque take on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the scariest thing about it is Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The whole world knew, right? Everyone was watching. Everyone kind of was it McNamara or Bobby Kennedy? One of them said it was like, this might be our last Saturday. Like, they kind of knew, right? And it's, as you mentioned in your book, and now we know that there actually were some already assembled short to intermediate range nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, and it would have gone hot if LeMay had his druthers and went in there. 1983 is so creepy because the CIA was kind of watching it. It was a one-sided Cuban Missile Crisis.
It was completely happened behind closed doors. As you say, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very public affair. The president was addressing the nation. John F. Kennedy addressed the nation on many occasions. There was live television coverage from the Caribbean as U.S. warships intercepted Soviet merchant ships and the like. Many people I know in America looked from their workplace or from their home to the nearest nuclear shelter to work out, the quickest route should the missiles come in and so on. Everybody knew what was going on. The events in November 1983 happened completely behind closed doors. None of us knew what was happening. When I first got onto this story, I looked up in my work diary, what was I actually doing on the evening of the 8th of November 1983? Because we can be absolutely precise about when the peak of this scary moment took place that we're going to talk about. But the peak took place on the evening of the 8th of November 1983. And I looked up in my work diary. What was I doing? It was just another day at the office. It was just a normal, regular day. And as Robert Gates, who was then in 1983, was the deputy director of the CIA, later became, of course, the Secretary of Defense. As Robert Gates said to us at one point, he said, we might have been at the brink of nuclear war and we didn't even know it.
That's the craziest thing. It's as everyone that listens to this podcast knows, and as you'll now learn, I make weird analogies, but I was playing a video game the other day, and there's like a cutscene where your guy's walking off, and there's like a CIA sniper, and he's watching your guy, and he decides, for whatever, I don't know, stupid. But it just kind of dawned on me. I was like, man, like, I wonder if you'd ever know if at one point you'd been in the crosshairs of someone. Like, I don't think I have reason to. I'm not in the military. I'm not a political, revolutionary. I'm just doing a podcast. I'm sure I've upset some people, but I don't think I've been in the crosshairs. But I was thinking, like, how would you know?
You'd only know if you pulled the trigger. Then you'd know.
Yeah.
And we would only really have known how panicked the Soviets had become in November 1983 if they'd actually launched these weapons against the West, which they were about to do. Their entire nuclear arsenal was put on standby. These giant SS-19, 100-ton, 30-meter tall, 100 feet tall missiles with 8 warheads on each missile. The crews to fire them were standing by for the fire order. The SS-19 missiles have been deployed to their places the SS-20 missiles have been deployed to their hidden spots in the forests and the swamps of Russia, hidden from overseas, from aerial photography, satellite photography. The submarines, the nuclear armed submarines have been deployed to their position, their battle stations under the Arctic ice. There were aircraft on the end of the runway in East Germany and Poland, engines running, waiting for the order to go. It got to that point.
It's Cuban Missile Crisis is the old Western. Both guys are standing in the middle of the road, right? Like the saloon and the general store, and it's they're both kind of tickling the trigger. This was Jason Bourne. Someone's got the scope on you, and you're just, you're walking back from McDonald's. You have no idea there's a bead on you.
You're having a happy day.
No idea. And to me, that's what's more terrifying, is because we didn't know about it. We also, we'll go into that later, it hasn't happened again. But yeah, I kind of want to touch on that. I've had on Garrett Graff before, author of Raven Rock, whose whole book about the nuclear bunker system, and I just love sort of, no pun intended, the brinkmanship of it. I just think it's fascinating, the hierarchies, the different tiers of alerts. And what you described, those mobile launchers, I'm sure you've seen them if you can't name them. It's those big trucks that kind of look like 18-wheelers, but they've got like 30 wheels, and they carry the big, it's, instead of a rocket launcher, it's an ICBM launcher. But I thought it was fascinating how you said, they go out into the woods, right? It's within like 150 kilometers of their base. Normally there's, I think you said, only 10 to 15% out in the field, but on that day they put out 50, and they're ready to go, and they have camouflage nets on them, which, makes sense. Sure, you don't want satellites, but they also are radio absorbent. So they can't even, can't even pick up the, I guess the RF waves coming off of them, which is mind-boggling.
And the interviews that we did with the people who remembered that, the Soviets or Russians who then Soviets, they all remembered this evening, that evening, the 8th of November 1983, really clearly, partly because it was linked. It was the day after the big revolution, the October-November Revolution celebrations, which every year was a big event in the Soviet Union. So they remember it being linked with that. But also they remember it as the only time in their careers when they were put on this final state of alert. And the guy in the bunker, in the silo bunker, with these huge SS-19 missiles, the equivalent to the Thor, the Atlas, not the Thor, sorry, the Atlas or the Titan missiles in the missile silos in the Midwest of the United States. He told me that on that one night, for the first time ever, a third person appeared. There were two men who had fuel control, the keys that could launch. The two separate men had to operate the key, turn their keys at exactly the same time as they rehearsed and practiced and so on. On this night, there was a third person appeared. Who is this person? And he just says, I'm here to make sure that if tonight you get the order, you follow the orders. And he was, as you just said, he was KGB.
Nothing there.
Secret policeman, just to make sure that you follow orders.
Right over your shoulder, just to make sure you don't get any cold feet, because now is not the time for cold feet. Which is just, I mean, and yeah, like you said, they always said that the war would come on the anniversary, right? So that, they thought it was going to come on the eve of a big anniversary. And it's, I mean, you can kind of see that one-sided Cuban Missile Crisis where, and I know I'm butchering it, I don't remember if it was Bobby or McNamara, but apparently they were leaving the White House or something, and they're like, this might be our last Saturday. But you kind of have that one-sidedness, right? You had one of those missileers say goodbye to your, wife and kids thought it was just, whatever, Friday, but he was saying goodbye, but like actually saying goodbye because he didn't know.
Indeed, absolutely. And they really thought it was. But on both sides, Tommy, there was a conference after the Cold War was over. There was one of these sort of conferences where both sides get together to sort of, not to reenact, but to sort of remember. And they had one devoted to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And guys were leaving the Kremlin on that same Saturday saying, I don't know, we'll ever go back to work tomorrow. This could be the last night of our lives. So in Washington and in Moscow, there was this sort of very public awareness that this was a disastrous moment, or potentially disastrous moment in sort of world history. Not the case in November 1983. Nobody knew about it.
You mentioned an alert level that I thought was fascinating because of the way you described it. I know, but was it strict or it's where it wasn't just that they were on ready alert.
Yes, the strip alert.
Strip, yeah. They sat at the end of the runway.
That's the aircraft.
Yeah.
The aircraft at the end of the runway. Yeah. It's called a strip alert. And you can only do it for half an hour, say, because you're absolutely, the pilots are there waiting. Their engines are running. They're just waiting. All the brakes are on. They're waiting to take the brakes off and fly to whatever target they've been assigned. And you can only do that for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Either you fly off and aim for your target, or you have to be replaced by another squadron that comes out.
I thought, there's something about that I thought was so sexy. I mean, there's always, right, with like the PSYOPs, right, Eisenhower always said, it's like, we can do this one now, we could do this within 12 hours, we could do this one within 50 hours, but then you're giving away movements to satellites watching you. And then there's obviously, right, the klaxon sounding and the guys off it running out to the B-52s. But that was completely different. It's no, because there's like a level above like scrambling in the U.S. and I think it's called a cart start, where they have these like explosives that like quickly start at B-52. But even that is like, there's a little more to it. This, for everybody listening, this is end of the runway, like brakes on, engines. Your helmets aren't off waiting for it. It's helmets on, like hands on like the throttles, and it's just, it's the Olympics, right? The guy has the pistol and you're looking at it, you're waiting, and like you said, you can only stay in that position for so long. And I think, well, not only fuel, but what you also said was the crews got emotionally exhausted. They'd sit there and then they'd be like, take me out, coach, put in the next one.
I think the sprint analogy is a very good one. Get ready, get set.
Yeah, and then it's not even like, misstart, and misstart is the end of the world. There's no, well, not really, missile, I guess you could come back, but just insanity. And then the other thing you talked about, the Typhoon, am I getting that right? The Typhoon class submarines, those massive Soviet subs, and they've got the
enormous submarines that were often sitting at the bottom of the ocean for months and months at a time.
Absolutely insane. And I remember actually seeing some images of the inside of one a couple of years ago. And they have there's like a hot tub in there.
That's right. Yes,
and it's the most
in a submarine. It's just extraordinary.
Which is, it's one thing to be in like a military vessel for there to be like leisure, and then there's like a whole another level of like irony when it's like the Soviet, no excess, no capitalism, and it's like they had a hot tub, but it's the same thing. It's because it was like they got to be comfortable, because that thing's just, that is, it's the probably one of the most, or I would say probably the most important leg of the nuclear triad is, that is true mutual assured destruction. We're going to sit under the Arctic ice. We've got, 12, 24 warheads, each one with 8 MIRVs on it, each one 10 times stronger than the Nagasaki bomb. And we're just going to wait here. And, you might do a decapitation strike, you might take us all out, but we're going to rise up after a month, 6 months, whatever. And our missiles aren't that accurate, so we're not going to aim at your bases. We're going to, we'll roughly aim for Times Square, Chicago, and, maybe central LA. That is, it actually inspired me so much. I went out and found 2 former nuclear submariners this past week, authors, and I mentioned your book, and I said, I'm reading this right now. Would you come? And so they're actually going to come on sometime next week to talk about it. So your book inspired me for that.
Yeah.
Now we've been going, I just realized you obviously wrote the book, and I've listened to it several times now. We haven't really gone into what Able Archer is. So for everyone listening, it was a drill. I'll give you a really quick example. It was a drill that we were practicing, and the Soviets were afraid that it wasn't a drill. It was actually covertly us getting ready for nuclear war. But you, the master on this subject, could you give a more in-depth explanation of exactly what Able Archer was and why we were doing it?
Sure. I think we've just got to go back, spool back a little bit, because the Soviet reaction to Able Archer doesn't make sense unless you see it in the context of the year 1983, a very dangerous year, very tense year. And let's just remind ourselves, Reagan was in the White House talking very aggressively. His rhetoric was really powerful against the Soviet Union. He called it the evil empire. Then he announced his Strategic Defense Initiative, which immediately was tabbed the Star Wars Initiative, that they would build a shield over the United States and shoot down incoming missiles in space. There were these psyops, there were these, and also what Reagan was doing was rearming America. You know, after a period of perceived relative weakness, they were rolling out stealth bombers, new tanks, the M1 Abrams tanks, the F-18 fighter. There was a whole new arsenal of equipment was coming out. Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Defense, and he said in his very first press conference in 1981, "My mission is to rearm America." So America was acting tough, talking tough. It was spending a lot more on its defense expenditure. It had roughly doubled over 2 or 3 years from the end of the Carter era. And on the other side, in the Kremlin, there was this elderly leadership. Brezhnev was there until November 1982. He'd almost become a joke. He was so infirm. He was so decrepit. He would read out prepared speeches and then step back and let anybody else answer, or somebody else answer questions. And he's replaced in November 1982, not by a younger man, not by a new generation, but he's replaced by the head of the KGB, who is roughly the same age, a man called Yuri Andropov. Andropov brings the sort of paranoia of the KGB. You know, they're all out to get us, whether it's internally or externally. He brings the paranoia of the KGB right to the center of the Kremlin. And he'd set up this KGB operation. It was called Operation Ryan. Ryan is the acronym for the Soviet words for nuclear attack. And the KGB agents all around the world were told to look for signs that the West was preparing to attack. They really thought that they were hurt, they were offended by Reagan's rhetoric, but they actually believed that he might be planning an attack, maybe a decapitation attack, just to take out the leadership in Moscow, maybe an attack against their missile systems. And they convinced themselves that this was a genuine possibility. So intelligence agents all around the world, in London, in Paris, in Washington, are told to look for signs that the West is about to attack. And of course, I think what we now know about intelligence agencies is if you ask these operatives to find evidence of something, they don't turn around to their bosses and say, "You're crazy, don't be ridiculous, everything's fine over here, nothing like that's going on." They say, "Oh, right, well, in order to be promoted, in order to be good for my career, I've got to find evidence of what these guys are looking for." So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy almost. The KGB heads say, "Find us evidence that the West are about to attack," and lo and behold, the intelligence operatives go out and find evidence. I mean, or fabricate evidence or make up evidence. They're sort of, you know, they're told to do perfectly sensible things like monitor the leadership, look out for increasing blood banks being built up in hospitals, see if people are planning to evacuate or changing their schedule or something. But then they're told to do crazy things like count the number of lights that are on in the Pentagon at night. They think that if America is planning an attack, then the guys in the Pentagon will be working late. And so if you just count the lights on and suddenly they increase, this is clearly a sign that America is about to launch a nuclear attack. The same thing in London. They had to count the lights on in the Ministry of Defense. It didn't seem to occur to them. These might be operatives cleaning the offices, you know, if there were lights on in the night. So it all got rather absurd, but it was a sign of this Soviet paranoia that they were believing the sort of rhetoric that was coming from Washington. And then a series of events happened in the summer, at the end of August 1983, the Korean airline disaster, which I'm sure many of your listeners will remember. This airliner, for reasons that we still don't really quite understand today, veers 365 miles off course, crossing the Kamchatka Peninsula and then the Sakhalin Island. These are sensitive Soviet defense areas. And the Soviet early warning system responds by shooting this airliner down. They got confused, their radar got confused with a spy mission that was going on earlier in that night, and hopelessly inefficient and incompetent bungling. They actually shoot a civilian airliner, a jumbo 747 down with 269 people killed, which provokes outrage in Washington. You know, Reagan calls this a terrorist act.
Sorry to interrupt, with an American congressman on there, correct?
He was, that's right, yes, a right-wing congressman.
Yeah.
And there was some suggestion that this was a sort of bizarre assassination attempt just at this one man. But you know, I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. It was just bungling on behalf of the Soviet fighter defenses that didn't distinguish between a military plane and a civilian airliner, a jumbo airliner. So the tension that was intense throughout the year is sort of suddenly ratcheted up a bit further at the end of August. And then one of the things they were looking for, one of the things that the Soviets were convinced would be the sign of an imminent attack, was if American bases around the world go on a high state of alert. And at the end of October 1983, there was a huge truck bomb in Beirut. 240 US Marines were killed as this Hezbollah suicide driver took a bomb right into the US Marine base. Terrible, terrible incident, terrible terrorist act. But the response was that American bases around the world went on to a heightened state of alert in case there were going to be other terrorist attacks. What do they do in the KGB? They don't link this alertness with the events in Beirut. They think, aha, here we look, here's another indicator. American military bases are going on a heightened state of alert. There's extra security around them. They must be preparing to launch a nuclear attack. Also at the end of October, the Americans, Reagan ordered the invasion of the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada, where there was a communist, strong communist sort of attempted takeover. But the invasion was very successful. But the Caribbean was a Commonwealth island, a British Commonwealth island, and they hadn't told the British government, they hadn't told Margaret Thatcher that this attack was coming. She was very, very offended. British territory has been, or Commonwealth territory has been invaded without us knowing. So there's a huge communications traffic between London and Washington. In Moscow, they don't know what the traffic is saying, but they can pick up the signals that are going. This is another signal. This is another indicator, you know, another box ticked that these wily Americans are about to attack us. Then comes, and now I'm coming back to your question, with all this background context in the run-up to November 1983, then NATO starts this exercise called Able Archer. It's an annual exercise, and it's an exercise that practices what would happen if there was a conventional war that NATO lost. So it doesn't actually deploy troops, it just deploys radar operators. It was called a command post exercise. And the people playing the war game in a bunker in Belgium get fed in these messages that the Soviets are attacking in Greece, the Soviets are attacking in, the Red Army is attacking in Yugoslavia, then the Red Army attacks across the Fulda Plain in Germany into West Germany. And they have to figure out a response. None of this, of course, is going on, it's just a war game. And the end stages of the war game is that the NATO chiefs request the use of nuclear weapons to defend the West from this overwhelming onslaught of conventional Red Army troops, the Warsaw Pact troops. And the Soviets are now getting really panicked, and at this point convince themselves, maybe this isn't a war game, maybe this isn't an exercise, maybe this is the real thing. They partly think that because in their own plans, if they're ever going to attack the West, they're going to use a war game as a deception. They're going to attack at the end of a war game. So they think, well, that's what the Americans and the NATO operatives are doing to us. And that all comes to a head, as we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, it all comes to a head on the evening of the 8th of November, 1983, when Andropov, who's a very ill man at this point. He's on a kidney dialysis machine. He's not in his office in the Kremlin. He's actually in a clinic just outside Moscow. And he sits up through the night with the man with the nuclear codes. It's the equivalent to the what's called the nuclear football in the States. It's called the Chegets system in the Soviet Union. But it was a similar system. There was a series of codes that only the sort of head of state had the authority. Well, actually, it was slightly different in the Soviet Union in those days. But anyway, only a small number of people had the authority to issue the codes that would launch the nuclear weapons. So all this arsenal, as we were saying earlier, the ICBMs, the portable missiles, the submarines, the aircraft, they were all on maximum stage of alert on this evening as the Soviets had convinced themselves that this wasn't just a NATO war game, but this was the first stage of a preemptive assault by the West, and they had to be prepared, and their fingers were literally hovering over the nuclear button to press that button to launch this tirade of nuclear weapons against Western Europe and North America.
Which would have, beautiful explanation, which would have been the end of the world.
Yeah, indeed, very quickly, because what would have happened in a major nuclear exchange, because the United States would then have responded, as Britain would. Britain also had nuclear capability. Britain and the United States would have immediately responded by launching the nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union. So probably most of Western and Eastern Europe, probably a lot of North America and a lot of Western Asia would have been destroyed. But then that would have created what was called in those days, what still is called, a nuclear winter, whereby the radioactive cloud and dust sort of goes right around the world. So, whether you're in New Zealand or South Africa or Argentina, nothing to do with the conflict, but everybody would have been affected by this. In fact, Tom, I think probably it wouldn't just be the end of human life. It could almost have been the end of all life on this planet.
100% would have been the end of the biosphere. And as you said, except for the scorpions and the cockroaches, right?
That's right. They might have survived.
They'd inherit the earth. It's and it was it was that quote you used. It was right when the elephants fight, the grass suffers.
That's right. Yes, that's what Nyerere said when he was told. Julius Nyerere was the president of Tanzania, and he came up with that. Yeah. When the elephants fight, the grass gets hurt. Yeah.
And that's 100% what would have happened. And then it's like, with the American flag behind me, I mean, obviously I'm going to take my side. And as you said, I mean, they shot down a civilian airliner. It's very easy for us, and myself guilty probably more than anyone, to, they are the evil empire. They have no regard for human life. But I mean, you look at Eisenhower, I think Eisenhower's reports, or I think his first reactions when he got to look at the first U-2 flights was something along the lines of he goes, oh, they're just people. Like everyone in the intelligence community was looking at it, and it's like, it's not 10 million troops marching around. It was just, it's a lady pushing a cart or like an ox pulling some hay, and it's just like, oh wait, they're just people too. Or Reagan's analogy, a Susie and a John and an Ivan and a whatever. But it's when you look at that, you then also have to extrapolate, and it's, well, they're going to defend their homeland. I can't sit here and defend the United States and you defend the UK, and then we can't pretend like. Although I do agree, I do think it was an evil empire. I mean, the number of people that were killed in the gulags is unfathomable. But at the same time, if you're not Taylor, if you're, Igor and I'm Ivan, and we're doing this podcast in a parallel universe where the Soviet Union survives, we would be going, I kind of see what the Americans were doing. They were defending their homeland. And it's when you have Reagan going out there and jacking up the over several years to a couple trillion, when he wants to develop SDI under Lieutenant General James Abramson, we're going to shoot down, that completely destroys the balance of power, the mutual assured destruction of the old Western with the guns and we're pointing at each other. What that is now is that's an old Western shootout, but now someone has a riot shield. And it's like, well, now you don't really have any deterrence to you shooting, which destabilizes it more. So, I mean, you can't really blame them. I mean, you can, and I do, but you can't really blame him. When you have Reagan going, they're an evil empire. When he's going to churches and he's like, these are godless heathens. We need Christians for nuclear armament. When it's we need lasers in space. Edward Teller, right, using X-rays to just was it the Kasaba howitzer, the nuclear shape charge we're going to use to shoot down things in space? And hey, we can have no nuclear weapons, all right, but no SDI. I'm sorry, we can't do that. And it's like, we could have a deal. And they walk out of Reykjavik, and it's like, can you blame them? I mean, they're inferior. Yeah, it's.
Yeah. I think there are several sort of lessons to be taken from 1983, and one of them is American intelligence knew a massive amount about the military capability. They knew the number of missiles, roughly speaking. They knew the range of the missiles. They knew the aircraft, the submarines. They knew their capacities and their capabilities. What they didn't have any idea about is what the guys in charge were thinking. They had completely lost that sort of level of human understanding of what the other guy's thinking about. And they had no idea of the panic that they were generating, that the Reagan's talk and SDI and Star Wars, accusing the Soviets of being a terrorist state, they weren't giving them respect.
Yeah.
But they had no idea quite how much this was alarming the Soviet leadership. And that's a real issue. There are states today that in the West we don't really understand why are they doing what they're doing, why are they thinking what they're thinking. So I think one of the lessons from 1983 is that intelligence has got to understand the mindset of the other side, not just their military capability. You don't want to just know how big the boxing glove is that they're wearing. You also want to know, are they going to use that boxing glove, and why might they use it? So I think that's one of the things that comes out of this. And of course, the postscript to this rather extraordinary story of November 1983 is that when Reagan is told about this Soviet scare, and that comes, in fact, through British intelligence, because Britain has a mole, a double agent inside the KGB who reports on this panic and passes it on from London eventually to Washington and to the White House. Reagan is just blown away. He says, surely they didn't think I was actually going to, we don't do Pearl Harbors. We're not going to launch an attack out of the blue on the Soviet Union. How could they possibly think I was going to do that? But he's very shaken by this. He calls this really scary, So he becomes determined. I mean, he in the 84 presidential election, he sort of tones down his anti-communist stand, and he's looking for an opportunity to reach out, to get to know the other side. But there's still a succession. When Andropov dies in 1984, he's succeeded by an even older man, Alexander Chernenko, who's even older and even more infirm. And it's not until 1985 when Chernenko dies, so that's the sort of the third elderly Soviet leader in about as many years dying. It's only then that the Politburo decide, right, now we need to go down a generation. Now we need to bring in the new breed of Soviet leader. And of course, the person they select, who changes the face of history, is Mikhail Gorbachev. What does Reagan do? He reaches out, he invites him to meet, and surprise, surprise, when they meet, they get on well.
Yeah.
They disagree fundamentally over ideological, Gorbachev is a hardline communist, but he understands where Reagan's coming from, and Reagan begins to understand where he's coming from. So instantly, there's sort of the possibility of either side pressing the button first sort of instantly drops. It's transformed, and it begins a series of events that, we know what happens. There's the Geneva summit, there's Reykjavik, there's Washington, there's the first of the big arms limitation agreements. Intermediate nuclear weapons are abolished or reduced in 1988. And really, it's the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So this remarkable, extraordinary event in November 1983, in the end, brings good. It brings a realization, probably on both sides, that they need to understand the other guy a bit better. And slowly, the process that leads to the end of the Cold War. So it is a remarkable story, not just for what happens in November 1983, but for the aftermath as well.
And you can you can kind of see, how much and I said this the other day doing a podcast, it's almost kind of odd. It'd be funny if it wasn't life and death for billions of people, but it's kind of funny how much just like the most base, almost immature aspects of the human psyche come into these things that shape the world. Okay, on a microcosm, it's like I emailed you like 6 months ago. I've read your book, and it's like I'm gonna have them on. I'm doing the podcast, right? I'm living the dream. But what's the first thing I say? I turn on my camera, and I'm like, I got a pimple, and it's like, it completely, eclipses everything, and it's despite these multiple these MIRV tipped thermonuclear, not even the atomic bomb, I mean the hydrogen bomb on these missiles and these submarines and out in the woods and SDI, and we're going at each other, and we got spies, and we got Hansen and Aldrich James, and you're taking pictures inside of your squash racket or what the hell he's doing, and you have all this stuff, and at the same time a lot of it just comes down to the Soviets kind of felt inferior. There's a little bit of inferiority complex. Reagan kind of took his acting along with it. He played the role of president and was, here's an evil empire. And you see just how much that does. I mean, really, when the elephants fight, you can see that like downward trickling ripple. And then it's not even, we got SDI and now we're going to have peace. It wasn't that at all. It was just they kind of met up and they kind of hit it off, right? They were, they just kind of goofed off, and it was like, all right, what's up?
In a chalet on Lake Geneva by a log fire on a cold winter's evening, and just found they got on well.
Yeah, right. It's just like, and it's almost cheesy. If it was a movie, it'd be cheesy, right?
Exactly.
But it's what happened.
You couldn't write stuff.
Yeah, you couldn't write the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's like that's what happened. You can't write they have the lighting just right for the cameras, the log fire's going, and it's like, should we go cut off the president? And it's like, you should lose your job if you think that's what you do. And
right.
It's almost kind of like a blind date. There's almost like a reality, right? It's like they got the whole thing. It's like the lawn's mowed, the log fire's going, like Ronnie's got his cards, don't worry. And they've all got, it's kind of like drama. Like, Ronnie went and met him at the limousine and he wasn't wearing a coat, but you notice he was wearing a coat. Now, what does that mean? And it's like, this is just the fate of billions of people in the biosphere. But at the same time, it's kind of beautiful that can be remedied with just, not to sound eye-rollingly cheesy, but when you see the other person as a human and not as an evil empire, but rather a difference of, hey, you're communist or capitalist, but is it a Susie and a John and an Igor and a whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these things, we've always got to remember that no matter how sophisticated the systems are that are built up around, in this case, we're discussing nuclear weapons, but it could be lots of other things as well. But in the case of nuclear weapons, there are very sophisticated protocols, fail-safe systems, dual controls, electronic locks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very sophisticated system to control nuclear arsenals. But in the end, there's an individual sitting somewhere who's got to make a decision. And that individual is going to make his decision or her decision on all sorts of bases that aren't necessarily rational. The thing about crises is that as crises escalate, it's very difficult to keep them rational. The opportunity for misunderstandings, for miscalculations, for panic to come in. And that's as true today. It's not that we're better at all this today than we were in the 1980s. It's just as true today with North Korea, with Iran, with the Islamic State. There's all sorts of possibilities for things to get out of control very, very quickly. And somebody somewhere has got to make a decision how to respond.
Yeah.
What we've got to be thankful in 1983, and this might be because the Soviet leaders had lived through the Second World War and the immense destruction of Soviet Russia that had seen. The Germans absolutely laid waste to hundreds of thousands of square miles. 27 million Russians died in what they called the Great Patriotic War. And the guys who were in charge in 1983 had lived through that. So they were that bit more hesitant They weren't quite as gung-ho. You know, they knew what the destruction of a generation looked like, and they didn't want to see that again. And that's my explanation, more than anything, why they didn't press the button that night, because they knew that they would be committing a national suicide by doing that. They'd seen a bit of that in their early lives in the 1940s, and they didn't want to see it again in the 1980s. But in the end, the point I'm making is that somebody somewhere has to, and it's the human factor that ultimately controls all these things. There's somebody's got to make a decision. And Reagan was very clear on this. He wrote about it afterwards. He said, you know, what if the Soviets had a submarine in the west of the Atlantic that fired a missile, could hit the White House in 6 minutes? He says, I've got 5 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar screen. How could anybody make a sensible decision, the consequence of which might be the end of planet Earth? How can anybody make sensible decisions under those sorts of pressures? But in the end, you know, we're human beings. Somebody somewhere has to make a decision, and that's as true today as it was in the 1980s.
I almost wonder if, and this is, I guess, where I turn into the armchair expert in my podcast, is I'll often find myself talking about, you know, coronavirus or assassinations, and it's like, hey, I'm 30 years old. I don't have a medical degree. I wasn't in the military. I'm not a nuclear physicist. But because it's my podcast and I can be an armchair professional, I'll do it anyway. I wonder if, like, once every 10 years, once every 20 years, like somewhere out in the South Pacific, if they just did like a globally televised, like 4K HDR broadcast testing of like a thermonuclear weapon. Maybe if you did one every 10 years, maybe that would put the fear of God into everyone so you can't forget it.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, they did do that in the 50s, of course.
Oh, yeah, well, it was in style.
Yeah. All those first hydrogen explosions in Bikini Atoll and other places in the Pacific, you know, tens of thousands of tons of coral were sort of picked up and thrown into the stratosphere by these huge explosions. The footage of them, if you look at film,
I watch them all the time.
It is just awesome. It's overwhelming. And so I think you could be right. Yeah, it'll just remind. Of course, all those tests were banned.
Yeah, it's 63, I think, or 70 or whatever. But yeah,
that's right. It was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was the partial test ban treaty and so on. But I think you could be right. Or maybe we should all just, you know, get the film of those explosions out and run them, you know, every Christmas or something, and just say, thank God we've got through another year, you know, without having this mushroom cloud over a part of our planet, you know.
See, I think you would, and then what, was it Castle Bravo? That one pulled up 80 million tons of coral. There's a fun fact a lot of people don't know, when they're testing the SR-71 Blackbird up at the upper heights, like 85,000 feet, it would start to get this black goo on the windshield, or not the windshield, the cockpit glass, and they weren't sure what it was. They weren't sure if this was like, is this some sort of weird caustic corrosion that only happens at Mach 3? Because, you know, they're testing these new boundaries. What it was is there's quintillions and quintillions of perfectly preserved but dead and frozen insects that were sucked up from the thermonuclear tests in the 50s and 60s, pulled them up into they weren't close enough to be vaporized, but they got sucked up, and they've been floating around just below low Earth orbit, and they're still there. But I don't even really know why I made that point. But the thing is like, there might be something that is, I mean, half of it's I just kind of want to see a nuclear weapon with modern like cameras, but you know, I think when you look at like an old, you know, video of it, you do see their awesome power, but it's also, you know, you see guys that, you know, they're also living fans of Mickey Mantle, and you see women that look like Marilyn Monroe, and you know, they have the cars that they're testing, but they're like 1940s, you know, Fords and stuff, and it might be hard to connect. I think more than anything is, I mean, you might need to have world leaders there. It might be, I forget who it was, but someone described what it was like to witness a nuclear explosion. And he said, it wasn't just that you saw it. It was, it was 60 miles away, and instantly it felt like, I think, as you said in your book, it's like sticking your hand into an open oven, like you're getting a pizza out. They
Yeah.
also described in, I think, Annie Jacobson's book, DARPA, she describes, they say it's more than just what you see and feel, the heat. They say you can smell it, because the shockwave changes, I guess, the density of like ozone at like sea level. You can smell it, you can taste it. They say it, one guy said it feels like it's pouncing into you. Said it feels like it's a cat that jumps at you. It jumps into your soul, and he goes, you wish it would stop. But there's this whole sensory immersion, and it's, when you're watching TV and it's 1 a.m, you see a woman come on, and it's like, for 10 cents a day you can save a kid in Africa. You're like, put the game back on. But then you go visit the local homeless shelter or something, you like see a woman, a widow with 2 kids, and you're like, oh, whoa, hold on. So you see the guy ringing the bell, so you go over and you put $20 in the Salvation Army thing instead of 25 cents, because you're like, oh, it's when you get out on a Christmas or on a December morning and you're in the Walmart parking lot and it's cold and it's gray and you see the guy ringing the bell, and you're like, oh, this is real. This isn't a thing I see on TV. It might help, and again, I kind of just want to see one, but it might help that you bring the world leaders out there on some aircraft carrier and you just drop a 10 megaton. I mean, not even one of those little puny kilotons. I mean, the end of the world, the sky turns red.
Maybe. Well, this could be your next project, Tommy. after the podcast series, it could get the world leaders together and take them to the South Pacific, to see a 24 megaton explosion.
If that's my next project, I'm gonna end up with Hansen and ADX Florence. If I start looking for a nuclear weapon to go off. I've kept you for 45 minutes. This has been a fantastic talk. I would love to have you on again sometime. Is there anything that you want to touch on that we didn't touch on?
No, I don't think so. No. I mean, there's lots of things we could talk about. We could talk about mutual assured destruction and all of that. But no, I think in terms of discussing this little known event, I mean, I felt very strongly that in writing the book, there was enough information. The National Security Archive in Washington, part of George Washington University, have done a fantastic amount of work in getting information out of the federal archives about this event. Because in America, when the CIA realized the scale of this, it was pretty embarrassing, actually. But for them, it was very, very embarrassing. Nobody really wanted to talk about it very much. I mean, all the parties involved in the events of 1983 were embarrassed. The KGB were embarrassed because they misunderstood the West and nearly launched a nuclear war, nuclear Armageddon. The CIA were embarrassed because they didn't spot what was going on. NATO was embarrassed because their war game had nearly triggered World War III. So when I started writing the book, nobody really wanted to talk about it. Nobody really wanted to admit what had happened or how serious it had been. But then with the work of the National Security Archive in Washington, slowly the information was sort of pulled out from the archives, and to the point where I felt you could write a full narrative of the events leading up to that year. And I hope we've covered those events reasonably simply. You have to read the book to get the full detail. But I hope we've covered the arc of what happened in that extraordinary and dangerous year.
I think it's a beautifully written book. I've been obsessed with the Cold War for probably 5-6 years now. I've really been obsessed with it. And I had never even heard of it. It's not something like Typhoon class Russian subs where like I've remembered that. Like I remember reading like a Wikipedia entry in high school, and like I know they're the biggest, and it's a periphery that one day you kind of go into. I had never heard of 1983. I had never heard of the entire scare, which, again, for anybody that's remotely interested in this, I'll put the link in the description. It's on Audible. It's a fantastic listen. It will scare the bejesus out of you. But I do have to ask, and that maybe this is just pure conjecture, and maybe we won't know in your lifetime or my lifetime. Do you think there's another 1983 out there that's already happened but hasn't been uncovered? I mean, maybe around 9/11? Could there be something in 2008? Could there be... There's something hiding in the shadows. Was there another fingers on the button?
Not that I'm aware of, no. There certainly wasn't in the Cold War era. I think we know enough now about how near we came to nuclear Armageddon on several occasions with accidents and technical failures and misunderstandings and computer malfunctions and so on. I think we know those stories by now. When we come to to more recent events, I think probably the jury's still out a little bit. I mean, it's difficult to say entirely. Some people look back on the Cold War with almost a sense of nostalgia. It was a bipolar world. There was them and us.
The bad guys, the good guys.
The bad guys and the goodies, exactly, yeah. There were two superpowers and their allies, and that was it. Now it's a much more complicated sort of multipolar world, where it is possible that there could be regional nuclear conflicts. For instance, India and Pakistan are both nuclear-powered states. And they regularly get into regional confrontations. And if one side get an advantage over the other, it's possible that the losing side will say, well, now we resort to nuclear weapons. We know Israel has nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and I suspect Iran will have nuclear weapons fairly soon. So goodness knows how that's going to play out. North Korea, probably the most unpredictable state on this planet, is developing some sort of nuclear capability. So I think the jury's still out as to whether there recently has been or whether there might yet be another of these sort of crises that escalates out of all control. But I don't know of one. If I did, Tommy, there would be another book on the subject, but I don't know yet. So if anybody watching this has got a good story like that, please contact me.
I could recommend Will Arkin, the author Will Arkin. I've had him on here a couple times, and he's written a ton of books. But I love his book, "The Generals Have No Clothes," and it's pretty new. The last chapter, the entire book is great, but the last chapter is really a standalone chapter, and I think as he was writing it was like 2019, and then it finished when COVID happened, and he writes about us watching COVID, is it going to come to the U.S. December 2019, January 2019, and I want to say in February 2020, we actually took two separate groups of individuals inside, not just inside of NORAD, but segregated from the rest of NORAD. We had a blue team and a gold team, and they had to be quarantined for 14 days. And then once they were in there, they couldn't interact with anyone else in NORAD. They couldn't leave. They were on like extended stays. Their families were told, hey, they're just, they're serving their country. And they had their own like HEPA, or HEPA, filtration systems. And they were there. And for the first time, I think from the Cold War, they actually shut the doors, the vault doors at Cheyenne Mountain. They buttoned it up. And then they had these, they were planning for civil unrest from COVID. And what they didn't foresee is that it actually started to happen with George Floyd. But they used that same war plan to where, and I think a lot of it's still highly classified, but they were slowly moving, military supplies to different cities in the United States. And we actually had our own little, if I'm recalling correctly, we almost had our own little DEFCON system for COVID, and I'm butchering it, and so I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't want to be fake news, but we had these quarantine teams inside of NORAD, which can survive or was designed for it, not anymore, just for 2020 with the breakdown. They were preparing for the breakdown of civil law, and then they were looking at COVID and potential breakdowns, which I said turned out to be George Floyd, and then they were preparing. They knew the 2020 election. They knew 6 months out. They're like, there's no way this goes off without a hitch. I mean, you got to think, is it going to be the year 2050 and we get a declassified book and it's part 2 of 1983. It's 2020, Biden, Trump, and COVID. How America I would imagine that there's probably some, maybe not DEFCON 2, but I would say someone somewhere. Maybe we had a couple B-2 spirits up in the sky somewhere. I don't know. Again, I also want to see that. And as you said, KGB, CIA, they'll get what you want to see. They'll fabricate it. So a lot of times I can fabricate my own realities. But who knows? Not that can be proved, but that is an interesting book. I will let you go. I've now kept you 10 minutes longer than I said I would because I'm a terrible host. Thank you so much for coming on here, man. You're absolutely brilliant. I love your book. I will listen to it again just because I like it. I highly recommend it to anybody listening. It's on Audible. Cough up $15. Go get it. It's perfect. And I'll email you when this episode is up. And I'd love to
Great.
chat with you again sometime. Do you have another book in the works?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I've been working on another book over the last few years, but it's related to some World War II subjects now, because I can't find that other big nuclear scare story from the Cold War. You see, I've gone back to World War II.
Well, hey, that's an endless well too. World War II and Cold War, as you showed with 1983. I don't think these subjects can be beat to death. Just when you think you've learned everything, I mean, you have a whole book that opens up a whole new chapter and not a negligible one. So, as you can tell, though, I'm going to keep talking because I like the sound of my voice. So I will let you go, sir. I will email you when the episode is up.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you. So,
thank you, sir, and thank you for your patience and putting up with my persistence. But as you can tell, I legitimately loved your book, and I wanted to talk to you. If that meant waiting 6 months, I'd do it. So thank you, sir. God bless. Take care. Go buy the books, guys. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Taylor Downing, go buy the book, 1983. Thank you. Good night. You have a wonderful evening.
Recording stopped.
God bless America. God bless the UK. Take care, everybody.